Probably the best introduction to Sam Otterstrom was that when he was asked to provide an introduction, it was 2 sentences. It was where he was from and where he got his degrees. I coaxed him into giving a little more. He's had a wonderful career and is a wonderful and extremely humble man. So I'm going to read the longer one that we've created here. Sam Otterstrom is an associate dean in the College of Family, Home, and Social Science and a professor of geography at BYU. He was born and raised in Spokane, Washington, served an LDS mission in New Mexico. Dr. Otterstrom researches population and settlement geography. He received his Bachelor's of Science and Master's of Science degrees in geography from BYU and a PhD from Louisiana State University. His book, From California's Gold Fields to the Mendocino Coast, was published by the University of Nevada Press last year and is the source for today's talk. He has also been an editor of 2 other books concerning North American historical geography and has published numerous articles and book chapters on migration, population change, LDS historical and contemporary population geography, and cultural landscapes. Before coming to BYU, he was one of the initial developers of the GPA Strategic Forecasting, now stat4.com, for international political risk assessment for an international political risk assessment firm. I'm going to get all this right. And a and a planner in Okanogan County, Washington. I got that kind of right? I'm so proud of me and you. He teaches courses in planning, which is where I've gotten to know him. He teaches with me. He's actually on the Board of Adjustments for Utah County, so he serves outside the university as well. World and regional geography, Europe, Latin America, and he runs most of our statistics classes, and historical North American geography. Dr. Otterstrom and his wife, Lori, are the parents of 9 children. He enjoys family history, hiking, tennis, and water skiing. Please join me in welcoming my friend, Sam Otterstrom, to the podium.
Thanks, Michael, for that very kind introduction. It's great to work with Michael and other colleagues that are here. Appreciate all of you who've come today. Appreciate Kirk Larson inviting me from the Kennedy Center and the Kennedy Center for hosting this event. Appreciate the college. They supported me on a professional development leave a number of years ago to take my family to Northern California to live in the foothills, Sierra foothills, and work on this book. And it took a while to finally be published, but that was a great support to me. I appreciate the Lori Weisler, our department secretary. She did a lot of editing work on this book over the years, so it's great to have her here today as well. So I love studying migration, and historical migration is a lot of fun. And California is a really interesting place to study migration. And with California's start with the early migration to California, we have a period of the Spanish colonial time, which was a pretty slow period of growth. But as soon as gold was found and the word got out, it grew very fast, and it's not just the gold fields, the whole state of California. So it occurred very quickly, and it settled very quickly, and that's really the topic of my book, and how it was settled at various different scales, and there's a connection between the rural areas and the cities that's very interesting throughout this period too, how they grew in tandem. They're just in the early, from the time of the gold find, when the word got out, to 1850s, and there's 300,000 migrants that came to California. And in 1848, just 4,000 miners. A number of those were Mormons. By 1852, there's 100,000 miners in the Sierras. And in the state, in 1850, 75% of the population of men were employed in mining. 1860, it had dropped to 38%, but still a sizable number of people in mining in the state. So what I want to explore a little bit today is the relationship between this migration and the processes that kind of undergird the migration into the gold fields and from there to other parts of the state. And there's a real interesting relation between the mines and other parts, other counties, and we'll explore that a little bit here. And also look at different scales of geography and how that's important for this development. So this is complicated, but so we won't really talk about it too much. This is my model I developed on looking at rates of growth and settlement growth and how to look at this at different scales. So in the book, I look at migration at the individual, family, social network, community, and regional scales. Today we'll just talk about these first three scales and how those relate to the growth. And also, part of the theme of the book too is how these family relationships at all these scales really tie people together through time and place. So, looking at these first three scales, we're going to consider the first 20 years of mining in the Sierras and how volatile that was in terms of migration. Secondly, we'll look at how that area helped bring about the settlement of other parts of Northern California in the Central Valley, especially in the coastal areas along the Mendocino coast. And then thirdly, we'll look at one family, the Winkler family, who settled in Sonoma County and how their descendants spread throughout the state. And finally, we'll look at the Mormon and the Mormon impact in the settlement and in the region. So Ravenstein is German. He came up with a number of laws of migration, and these have been studied and picked apart, and sometimes they've been found to be true, sometimes not so true. And I decided to look at some of his laws and relate them to our region. And these are that migrants, when they go long distances, they focus on commercial, industrial centers. The migration proceeds step by step, one small step to the next small step from place to place. The third one is they usually just go a short distance, and finally that it's usually single people that migrate, and not usually as families. So the first scale, we look at the Argonauts, the miners that came in this early time period. And how I did that is and looked at censuses in the mining areas, El Dorado County, Nevada, Placer, Mariposa counties, and just only one county between 1850 and 1860 because it was so hard to track anything going on between 1850 and 1860. But the goal was to see if you can find people in one census and then find them in the next, in the same place or somewhere else. And that got to be quite the challenge. So what in terms of Ravenstein's laws, we find here is that actually the miners, they moved farther, and they moved from all over the world to go to the mines, not to go to San Francisco. San Francisco was a secondary destination. So the law's a little bit different there. It was actually the mining center, which you could maybe say, okay, that's an industrial center, but that's where people are going to. And in this case, it was mostly men who migrated, single men or married men who left their families for a time to come to the mines and try out their luck. And a lot of times it was just like the lottery. Most people didn't get a lot of luck there, and they always hoped for it. So I looked at this region in the purple color. That's kind of the mining counties, and the blue, light blue, other northern areas. Sacramento is a separate place because a lot of people end up there, and then Southern California. So we divided up where people ended up from these counties from that kind of division there. So for example, Mariposa, we just did one county because it was, as I said, it was so difficult to find people. And there's 539 miners in 1850 in the county. In 1860, only 10% of those we only found 10% of those. And my students working on this, they tried really hard. We have family search, we have other things. And probably be a better luck now doing it with some of the matching that's gone on. But when we did it, there's only 10% found. And only 6 of those were actually still in Mariposa County. And so people didn't stay around very long. And this was the case even for the 1860, 1870 time, although it went up. 19% were found between the two censuses, and 17 of those were actually in the same county there, of the total 35 found. And by the next census, 15 were still in mining, and so there's a number that stayed within the same career. So looking at other counties, El Dorado and Placer, the total found between 1860 and 1870 hovered around 20%. Actually, you could actually find the people, let alone them being in the same county. So that's showed basically these people are moving all over the place. Their names are changing. They're dying. They're going other places. Some would go back to their country of origin. Some would head across the country, and they had a name like John Smith, and it was hard to figure out if they were the John Smith that was in El Dorado County in 1860. So this just kind of shows where they're from. A lot of them did come from other parts of the world, Great Britain and Ireland specifically, but most from the United States, at least half from the United States coming in El Dorado, 42% in Placer County. Let's skip a little bit from there. So you can see the number of people, the density. They're all working, hoping for a good find, but sometimes it was very difficult. I have a little story here that comes from this person named William Henry Hart. He lived from 1829 to 1888. He arrived from Illinois via the Carson route, which incidentally was built by the Mormons who were heading east, leaving California, heading to Utah. But it became a very important route for migration into California during the gold rush. He, along with the traveling companions, he came to Placerville on September 19th. He arrived there in 1852. He says this: "We reached Placerville, thus ending the trip. We found it a straggling, irregular town of unpainted clapboard houses, generally one story. I believe I am the only one of the train who is satisfied with the trip. The rest all say that they never would undertake it again. Most of them seem to expect a perfect pleasure trip, plenty of game, all fun, and no hardship." So a few days later, Hart was ready to try his hand at prospecting. He left with 8 associates, and on September 20th, toward the South Fork of the American River, about 30 miles from Placerville. They lasted a few days at their mining site before returning to town without any luck. Hart then made his way to Sacramento and San Francisco. So these are the places they're moving to just within this first year. Returning to El Dorado County on October 9th, he observed the operations at Coloma, possibly Colonia, and tried his hand for a day there, making $2.60, which is pretty good for a day. Then he headed out to attempt shingle making on October 18th. He says this: "Commenced work as a shingle maker. Streeter and I attacked a huge sugar pine some 4 feet in diameter and felled it after considerable hard work. We then took the crosscut saw and sawed the trunk into lengths of 20 inches, which we then split into blocks and split these into shingles on October 23rd. During the last week, the price of shingles has steadily fallen until they do not bring enough to pay our provision bills, and we have concluded to try mining. Having sold our stock and tools, we moved our camp utensils and provisions across the Immigrant Road and down a long hill into the bed of Weaver Creek, where we had heard were good diggings. They weren't that good." Hart continues, November 15th, "The recent rains, having set the creek to running, filled all the holes and diggings and affording us water sufficient. Henry Miller and I set our cradles and commenced washing out the pile of dirt that we had thrown up. Finished the pile by the evening of the 17th. The aggregate yield was $11.80 for 21 and a half days of work, making 55 cents a day to each man. Our provisions are costing us about 65 cents per day." Figure the math there. They gave up on mining in that place on December 5th. He says this: "Went to town and sold the gold dust and determined to abandon mining in Weaver Creek. Next, Hart tried to find mining work at nearby Coon Hollow on December 11th. In subsequent days, he also looked for work in Middletown, Cold Springs, and Gold Hill. The weather was quite bad throughout that time. He finally left for San Francisco, arriving on Christmas Day in 1852, and found it was suffering from a big flood. If you know about the history of California, it was a huge flood that year. He then took a steamer down to San Francisco, staying at What Cheer House. After a few months, he decided to try his luck again in the mines. March 21st, 1853, Hart headed to Mormon Creek in Tuolumne County. Here he stayed and mined a claim until September 1st, 1853. So that's about 6 months. On that day, he expressed, being very much worn down with the labor and exposure of mining, in hopes of obtaining mercantile employment, I have again concluded to try San Francisco. So in just 1 year, William Hart had lived in El Dorado County, San Francisco, Tuolumne County, as well as other places in between. It is no wonder that very few miners in the 1850 census were even close to the same county 10 years later when the next federal census was conducted. Later, he briefly worked in San Francisco and then Petaluma, which is in Sonoma County, followed by Napa for a longer period. He left Napa on December 19th, 1856, headed to San Francisco, and then took an adventurous sea voyage down to Nicaragua, across Central America, and then to New York. The trip lasted 34 days, which was much faster than when he traveled across by horse and wagon. So anyway, he went back to New York, and that was the end of his story. The point is that many of these people were moving all over the place, trying to find their gold, and it wasn't long before a lot of them gave up and would go home and go other places and start different work. So in El Dorado and Placer, the blue and the purple, you see between 1860 and 1870, the majority was still in the same place, but this is 10 years later. And what happened after the 1850s, mining slowed down, and it changed from placer mining to more intensive hard rock mining, quartz mining, and also to kind of industrial mining. So people would stay a little bit longer, but still they're going other places across the state and some out of the state. So just on this, between 1860 and 1870, these two counties, there was a number that stayed in mining, but there are other jobs, farming, laborers, manufacturing, so forth. There was a number of different jobs that they turned into. So some survived, some didn't. Okay, so what happened to these people? Looking at county histories, I got a nice kind of cross-section of people that had spent time in the mines and then left and went to other parts of the state. So it is an excellent resource actually for looking at migration history in these 1870s, 80s, 90s county histories that, back in those days, if you had money, you could pay and have your picture or at least your biography put into the county history, and because you were somebody. And so this sample maybe is not a sample that kind of captures everybody. For example, there are a lot of Chinese that were in these mines, and the Chinese are very, very, very difficult, if impossible, to track because in the censuses, many of them, you see a whole page of Ah Ching, Ah Ching, Ah Ching. That was their name, and you didn't really know who they were and where they were from, and so the next census you don't know, you can't track them. So this sample is biased towards the people that went on and were successful in their careers, many of them in farming and other types of things. But this ties us back to the idea that many migrants will only go a short distance in their migration once they got to their main place, and they'd go step by step. So looked at these mining counties, and then in the study area, looked at biographies in county histories and compared and looked at their mining, their movements. So, for example, in Clusa and Solano County, which are kind of in the middle area, 40% of the people in Clusa County had spent time in the mines before moving there. 26% in Solano County had spent time in the mines. So a lot of them were miners before, and so these are some of the counties that they lived in before they went to Clusa County, which you can see there, and same thing with Solano. They had spent time in the mines before giving up or whatever, or making their money and going and buying land in those counties. So, in where these miners originally from, this is for those that ended up these people in the biographies, in Lake, Mendocino, and Sonoma counties. You can see the real emphasis in the Midwest, in the Northeast part of the country. Also, in terms of other countries, Germany, Canada, Ireland, and Britain generally are where they're from. And so they came from all over the world, really from the northeastern part of the country, Midwest, northeastern part of the country. And so when they came into California, 45% from Lake County ended up in mining counties. San Francisco, 10%, 11%, and then some just went straight to the North Coast. These three counties are on the northwestern part of the state: Mendocino, Sonoma, and Lake counties that in the earlier map there. So similar pattern in these other counties. Mendocino, mining counties still are prominent, not necessarily the highest, where some people would go straight to those North Coast counties. So there's a segment, about a third of the population ended up in mining first before they moved to these other counties. Hope this is going to work. So, how did it happen? What they do there? So here's seven different people, and this is a map showing their migration from where they started and where they went. Sometimes they would move to a place in between. For instance, this is, I think, James Harris. Was born in Pennsylvania, moved to Michigan, came out to Lake County. You have this gentleman here that came over to this part of California down here and back up to Lake County. And you see him young, he liked going back and forth. And that happened. You had that a lot. And that was what's really interesting, I think. I was really surprised how much people actually moved. So in Lake County, you see there was 11 people that surveyed there that moved. 3 people that moved 11 times. But more likely they'd move 3, 4, 5 times in time, and 2 times to getting until they ended up in Lake County. So they would move back and forth, and so many would go back east in between that time period. So this is going into Mendocino County, same kind of patterns. You can see it seems pretty random. Where this guy went down to Alabama for a while. He was born. Where is he? Was Australia, or is that? Which one is he? Or William Wallach there. And so he'd been born in Austria, came into Pennsylvania, Philadelphia, then moved to St. Louis, then down to Alabama. Decided Alabama wasn't that great. Moved up to in Illinois, then over to Mendocino County. And so this pattern is repeated over and over again, and the biographies really tell about it and what they're doing too, and we don't have time to really go into that. So a similar kind of story where there's a big chunk of the population of these people in the biographies that had been number of moves, 3 to 6 moves in their life. Same thing with Sonoma County, and once again, the map looks very random. It's kind of fun reading their stories. So, just an example of this: W.W. Green in Lake County. He was born in Missouri in 1827, came to California in the wake of the gold rush in 1850. He mined for only a month in El Dorado County before going into merchandising, then farming in regions roundabout in Placer County, Sacramento area, Rough and Ready, Nevada County, and Auburn. You all know there's a place called Rough and Ready. It's a great name of a place. In early 1853, he returned to Missouri via Panama in order to retrieve his family. After a long ride across the Overland Trail, he and his family arrived back in Auburn, California in October. He remained there as a hotel keeper and teamster until he moved to Colusa in 1858. There he was a stockman, hotel keeper, and merchandiser in the city and county until 1869. He then moved to neighboring Lake County and was a hotel keeper and merchandiser there. He also ran the Bartlett Springs Resort for a time, as well as being a proprietor of Green's Hotel from 1872 to at least 1880. So I like these stories because these people, they not only moved a lot, they changed jobs. And we talk about our time now in the 21st century. Everyone's going to change their jobs multiple times because the technology is changing. These people changed their jobs just as much, and it's really amazing to watch. So. And then we don't want to spend too much time with this, but even within California, there was migration going on within these different counties, into Sonoma County, for example, and they they tried their hand in a variety of things within that. So our third scale is the family scale. And this is, on the left there is Clayton Winkler and his brother David Winkler Jr. And they were early settlers in California. And Clayton Winkler was born in 1831 in Irvine in Steele County, California, Kentucky. He was one of 7 children of David Winkler and Sarah Asbell, who were both originally from North Carolina. The family moved from Kentucky to St. Joseph, Missouri after 1836. There, both David and Sarah died of typhoid in 1840. So mom and dad died. One of the Clayton's younger brothers, named Simpson, also passed away in 1840, being about 4 years old. Clayton came west in 1849 with his brothers Archibald, Howard, and David Jr. as part of the Great Gold Rush. His younger brother, Howard, died somewhere along the route to California. The 3 remaining brothers arrived in Sacramento on October 18, 1849. Clayton spent some time in the gold districts trying to make a profit by finding enough of the elusive metal to save a little gold dust after his expenses. His older brother, Archibald, died in 1851 in Coloma, so that's not good, which is where Marshall's gold discovery was. And Clayton's only sister, who took care of Clayton Howard after they became orphans in 1840, never came west, but instead married in Missouri and raised a family in Indiana and Iowa. His older brother, Sidney, also settled far from California, so only David and Clayton were in California after 1851. However, David and his 2 children migrated north to Oregon, so it left Clayton in California. So, experiencing a period of poor luck in the mines, Clayton tossed a coin with a sailor friend to decide whether to stay in the mines or go to sea. The flip of the Spanish real directed Clayton and his companion to San Francisco in the Pacific Ocean. However, once there, his stint as a sailor was very short and unpleasant, for he got sick pumping bilge water and never went to sea. By some good fortune, on his return to the mines in 1851, he traveled through Santa Rosa and Sonoma County, where he met the Lancaster Kleiman family in Grayton. They befriended him and took care of him for a time. He liked the area so much that the next year he bought 200 acres from Mr. Kleiman in Green Valley, west of Grayton. And those 280 acres would be worth millions of dollars right now. I wish they were in the family. So the Clayton's farm was located on some of the most fertile land in California. So he came there, and he later married Martha Brain. Martha Brain is from Pennsylvania, and they were married in 1866. They had 9 children that were all born in Green Valley. This is the picture of the 2 of them with their home that they built there, and you see the barn in the background, raised fruit, beautiful orchards there. Their 9 children. So this is them with their 9 children in 1895. So what I decided to do is say what did with this, and this is genealogy because this is from my wife's family. This is her great-great-grandfather, is track down the descendants, see where the descendants went. And my wife's mother, Betty Winkler, she was able to, she did most of this work, so I have to give her credit because she's a great genealogist. So looking at these 9 siblings, Sarah Jane, the oldest, she lived to be over 100. She has up until 2006, 119 descendants. Arthur had 14. George never got married. He had no children. Harriet, 16 descendants. Oliver Milton, 234, and that's where we're from. Not surprising. There's the Mormon element's a big chunk of that, and that's just the last generation or 2. Okay, and then Edward Clayton, 32, Samuel Ernest, 28, Walter Scott, 34, so forth. So we have these descendants, and what's really interesting is how many they stayed close there. So all 9 of the children born right there in Green Valley, and the grandchildren, 22 grandchildren, 20 of the 22 were born in Sonoma County, which is 91%, and the other 2 were born somewhere else in California. Go to the next generation, 79%, third generation, were born in Sonoma County, and 21% born. So still, up to the next generation, the 4th generation, everyone is born in California. 5th generation, it's dropping every time, but 57% born in Sonoma County, with an additional 38% in other parts of California, and then 6th generation, it spreads out some. So you can see how close, and you talk about short migration. At first, we're talking about people coming across the sea and joining the rush for gold. Once they got here and settled, had a nice farm, and his family descendants stayed close. So this is a map of it showing the Green Valley is right there. This is Sonoma County, and places like Santa Rosa. 37 of the great-grandchildren are born in Santa Rosa, which is next door. Sebastopol, close, 22 born in that town there, and then others born other parts of the state and other places too. But you can really see the concentration of the population close, and not only in Sonoma County, there's a lot just in the Bay Area, and that's a function of this family connection and the tendency to stay close to where your family's from. And this is just a bigger picture. It's not a very good detail, but there's other parts of the country and the world as well. So our last scale is the social network scale, and this is very interesting, maybe for us, because it's the Mormon connection. And many of you are aware how much influence the Mormons have had in California. Some of you may not be as aware. California was having this transition, I said, between the Spanish-American period in the U.S. time in the 1840s, and there were three kind of main streams of migrants that connect to the Mormons during this time period. And there's a lot that was going on in terms of settlement and establishing commercial cities, and San Francisco, for instance. Yerba Buena was really settled. That became San Francisco was settled by the Brooklyn Saints and Sam Brannan, and they were a big chunk of the population for a time there. And then an out-migration that occurred later on in the 1840s and 1850s. So 1846, 200 people left in New York, came all the way around the Cape Horn, and made it here. 13 died at sea. I thought it was great. The story, I don't have time to go through it, but there's one baby was born named Atlantic, and one was named Pacific. So you can guess where they were born on this trip. It's great names for kids. And so that's the first group. The Mormon Battalion, 513 men left, and plus some women and children left Fort Leavenworth in 1846. You know the story. 371 plus a few others, women and children, arrived in 1847 in San Diego. How many have been down in San Diego to the Mormon Battalion? It's a visitor center. It's great. So then we have this migration of Mormons that between 1848 and 1850s, some were known as gold missionaries. In one sense, Brigham Young sometimes would preach against going out to the mines and joining up with the gold rush, but then quietly he did send some out to help to search for gold to try to keep the church afloat financially. So it's an interesting story there, and we don't have, there's a lot of detail with that. So looking at Ravenstein's laws here, it's not the same story, because a lot of this migration, especially the ship Brooklyn, these are families that migrated together, and they moved as a group, and they're connected, and so it wasn't so kind of free-for-all. And so I think this is interesting about when you have a tight social network that the Mormons have, that you can see that relationship. So just to show kind of the pattern here, 160 of the ship Brooklyn Saints remained in California from the 1840s and the 1850s. 95 went to, you might surprise you, a lot of them stayed in California. Sam Brannan came out to talk to Brigham Young and say, California's great. And Brigham Young said, sorry, we're not going out there. Sam Brannan wasn't very happy. And Sam Brannan was one of the ones that stayed there, and others did too. 20 people, went back to they decided they didn't like the West at all. 13 died of the voyage. Some went to Arizona and some went to Hawaii. So John Horner is an example of one that stayed in California. He became one of the richest farmers in the Bay Area in California, and produced all sorts of crops, especially in the time period. In the early time period, food was really expensive, and especially vegetables were very hard to come by. So he's from New Jersey originally. he had some farming experience there. He first planted wheat in San Joaquin Valley in 1847, but then moved in the same year to the mission to San Jose. His farming activities were a failure that year, although I got no dollars out of it. I got the experience, which I profited by in after years. I had tested the soil in different places with several different kinds of farm products. In the fall of 1849, the miners came with huge appetites for fresh produce, but found very local farmers to fill the demand. Harner wrote, "As I was the only farmer in the territory that had vegetables for sale, I was much sought after by customers from all sides. 2 wagons came several hundred miles distance and brought loads of vegetables." So he became a really wealthy farmer, and then he kind of lost his fortune, ended up going to Hawaii. Sam Brannan is one you're maybe more familiar with. He was the one that advertised the gold rush, and he went out and with his newspaper, the California Star, he went around the city saying, holding a bottle of dust in one hand and swinging his hat with the other, passed along the street shouting, "Gold, gold, gold from the American River." And that news spread around the world and really sparked the gold rush. And pretty much, it also made San Francisco a ghost town. Everyone left San Francisco to head out to the mines right there. And that's when it was the best mining. It was at the very, very beginning. So he got rich. He got really rich because he sold stuff to the miners, and he sold stupendous profits. The problem was there's some problems, like he didn't pay his tithing. And he held on to the tithing from his saints as well. That's a problem. And so he was one of the earliest millionaires in California. He went and built this resort in Calistoga, and it was a failure. And he lost his shirt there. He had a terrible divorce and lost everything, and ended up poverty-stricken. He had this land in Mexico that he'd gotten, but he wasn't able to really get any money out of it. So it's kind of a sad story, actually, about his life, but he was very instrumental in the early development of the state. So Mormon Battalion, they came in, and they came on the route you can see along the south. There, some of the other, this is the 6th Detachment, left Santa Fe, went to Pueblo, and came to Salt Lake Valley. The main group of the Mormon Battalion came along the southern route here, ended up in San Diego. You can see the other routes, though. Once they were there, some stayed on the military. Most of them decided we're gonna head north, and they went up and met up with the Saints in the New Hope Colony. It was part of the Brooklyn Saints. This was a very short-lived colony. Others went to Sutter's Mill. There were 6 Mormon Battalion members that were actually at Sutter's Mill when the Marshall's find occurred, and they actually the ones that wrote in the journals, because Mormons keep journals. So that's how we have record of this there. And so this is the reconstruction at Sutter's Mill. It happened there, and these are 4 of the original 6 that were still alive in 1898 when they had the 50-year reunion of the Mormon Battalion veterans there: Henry Bigler, William Johnston, Azariah Smith, and James Brown. So because of the mining and these different groups of people, they settled all sorts of places, and lots of the place names relate to this group. This is where Mormon Island, which was a very rich gold find along the river, is now the reservoir, Folsom Reservoir, so it was inundated there. But there is a Mormon Island relocation cemetery in that spot. In 1850, you can see where Mormons were, 313 right in El Dorado County, in the gold districts, 82 in Sacramento. So there was just a tremendous number right there at the very beginning. As I mentioned before, the Mormon Battalion members that headed to Utah to meet the Saints there in 1848, they built the Carson Pass Road, which was an amazing thing. It started in Pleasant Valley. Our ward when we lived in California for my leave was the Pleasant Valley ward. Pleasant Valley is where the Mormon Battalion was situated before they headed over the mountains. But some stayed in the mine, made a lot of money before they came to Utah. And some, as I said, stayed in California, never came. So these are some of the towns that that have good connections, either settled by the Mormons or have a big amount of history there. So you can see many of them have the toponyms: Mormon Gulch, Mormon Slough, Mormon Bar, Mormon Island, Mormon Bar, Mormon Ravine. And then we have Murderers Bar. I'm not sure what the Mormons are doing there. The Slapjack Bar. There's great stories with Porter Rockwell was there. He had his tavern. We have there's Mormon Tavern too. He had a run-in with Governor Boggs. That's a great story. It's a fun story. He came dressed up as somebody else there, actually no, that time he dressed up as someone else, and people were talking about the Mormons and so forth. But he had quite the connection. So there's people going back and forth, Boggs is in my book as well. His family migration goes along with the Winklers, and there's also a family called the Greenwoods that were important for the early settlement up in this area. Okay, so the Mormon impact's still there. Here's Mormon Street in the city of Folsom. So just a few concluding thoughts. At the individual scale, really see that the volatility of migration when you're coming into starting work in something that's so transitory, finding gold. I mean that's like a very difficult thing to do, and those that made it rich were very, very lucky. It's just, in a way, it was like gambling, because most of the people weren't that lucky, and so they kept moving around, and it was difficult, and so they're hard to track, these miners. But those in the second scale there, the mining area became an important hub for redistribution of population throughout Northern California, and I'd argue at least as important as San Francisco there, or maybe the par there on par with San Francisco, and they went on. Some that did make a little money, they'd use the money and they'd buy land and they'd become farmers and do a honorable job. It's honorable to look for gold, I guess, but so they would go into other careers, as I mentioned many times, multiple careers. And at the family scale, we see that once they got settled in one city or one town or another, their families often stayed close by for many generations. And looked at other families as well, but the Winklers are a really good example of this because of how big a family they had and how well they've been tracked by my mother-in-law. And then the social networks. The Mormons affected California's development in an interrelated and I think outsized way. That's the last line there. They really they have a huge impact really on California's development, and people might not recognize that because a lot of them left California, but they were there in the early stages, and they made a difference. And their migrations together are very interesting. So that's the cover for my book. I appreciate you being here. Thank you.
We have time for a few questions. We ask if you'd like to ask a question to come and use this mic here on this side for the benefit of our listening audience. And if you're a BYU student, please just tell us who you are and what you're studying.
I'm Andrew Smith, studying geography and econ at BYU. I was just wondering about the role of GIS in your spatial analysis, like how you may have used it.
I didn't talk about the chapter that I used it the most. On the chapter beyond this was looking at large-scale migration, meaning using genealogy, thousands of records to see where people went to. And so we used the family search, and then used GIS to kind of calculate all the distance of migration and how much, how close they were, and make a number of different indices for it. So that was an article that I pulled, that was published, and then pulled it into the book. I had a student that was a geography major and computer science minor that helped me with that. So the other one, having to do with just the mapping part, and so that was more just straight cartography. But that one chapter is the most. Thank you.
I'm Amanda, and I'm studying geography here at BYU. I'm in the environmental studies emphasis, and I was just wondering, I heard you talk a lot about how people were kind of going back and forth and moving to multiple places and like mining gold and doing agriculture. I was wondering if you had come across any information on sort of like the environmental impacts that came from that at all.
Well, yeah, there's a lot, and that really wasn't the focus of my book, but the in terms of the Sierra, the impact was tremendous because when they started doing early mining, it was digging some holes and things. When they started, taking a whole river and diverting it and putting millions of gallons of water down this channel, it just changed the whole environment. And so there's a lot of work done on kind of the environmental impact and the often negative impact of mining. And then with Northern California, in terms of the coastal part, there's a lot with with lumbering in the redwoods. That's part of that whole story as well. And one of my later chapters talks about northern, kind of the coastal areas a little more. So, thank you.
I don't want to take a student's spot.
You can do that, Jeff.
So Jeff Chamoy, History Department in Latin American Studies. So I know probably not the focus of your book, but what about the local Hispanic population as well as indigenous groups? I mean, I know, again, I'm not saying you need to know all about them, but kind of what did you, in your research, discover about
of course, the Hispanic population was very interesting in the early 1840s and how much land that they had and then didn't have later on. And the same with the indigenous population. So there was a lot of intermixing going on there. The indigenous, the people, they were really pushed off to the side. And in California is one of the saddest stories about the indigenous population and what happened to them, and how many died from disease and were put in these little rancherias, later on, and wiped out. And like Lake County, the military came up there and just wiped a bunch of them out because they had killed a couple of settlers there who had been really treating the Indians poorly, beating them, and so they were killed by the Indians because they kind of said, we're tired of being beaten. And then so the military came and just like wiped out the population, the good chunk of the Indians. So that happened a lot. I don't know if a lot, but it was going on. So the indigenous population was being impacted. The Hispanic population was there and part of the whole story. And sometimes they were more successful than others in terms of economically successful, and it wasn't really the focus. I wasn't looking at that kind of population difference along the way, but I kind of saw that as I studied. So, thank you.
Questions?
Well, thank you. Appreciate you.
Thank you.